both my hips.
Well, a pound of flesh.
You are live, Mayor Hudson.
Okay, let's call to order the Joint City Council Planning Commission meeting, a special meeting for October 19th, 2021. Before the roll call, the city attorney has an announcement.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Assembly Bill 361 suspends certain provisions of the Brown Act, allowing public meetings like this one to be held by teleconference to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. I'd ask you to recognize me after the roll call so that I can confirm certain matters for the record.
Okay, conduct the roll, please.
Commissioner Edwards.
Present.
Commissioner Marks.
Here.
Commissioner Wallace.
I'm here.
Vice Chair Alpert.
Here.
Chair Kuznick.
Here.
Councilmember Armstrong.
Here.
Councilmember Veros.
Here.
Councilmember Zafar.
Here.
Vice Mayor Perkins.
Here.
Mayor Hudson.
Here, recognize the city attorney.
Thank you. Based on responses to the roll call, the record should reflect that all council members and commissioners can hear the proceedings clearly. And if there are no objections from anyone, the record will further reflect that each council member and commissioner believes, based on voice or facial recognition or otherwise, that those representing themselves to be council members and commissioners are in fact council members and commissioners. And seeing no objection, I'll turn the meeting back over to you, Mr. Mayor, with a reminder that all votes must be taken by roll call.
Okay, thank you very much. While we're waiting for you to get the consultants in here, we're gonna do the highlight of the evening. That's a joint workshop on the general plan, housing element, and climate action plan updates. The recommendation is staff that the City Council and Planning Commission receive the staff report. I believe that will be Cindy Yee giving the staff report tonight. We will have some questions of staff before we open up the public comments and close the public comments and give some direction to staff and our consultant team regarding the general plan, housing element, and climate action plan update. So right now, let me see, you've got, how are we doing on the consultants coming in? Christina, they're part of it? Okay, looks like we're ready to go. Cindy, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, City Council members and planning commissioners and those in the audience. I can see our consultants are entering the room now as panelists. So I am going to go ahead and start with the presentation, and then I'll hand it over to our consultant team. So I'm assuming you can see my slide here.
Yes.
Great. And just a quick introduction for those that are not familiar with our planning team. I will be heading the general plan update as the project manager. Debbie Chamberlain and Lauren Barr are also in attendance this evening as the community development director and planning services manager for the city. Ryan Driscoll is also going to be helping with the update, but he is absent this evening. With that, I am going to turn it over to Brent Gibbons. He is with Mintier Harnish and leading the city's consulting team on the update for the general plan.
Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. Do I'll make sure everybody can hear me on your end?
We can.
The joys of working from home. So good evening, Commission. I totally get it. Good evening, Commission and Council. It's good to be with you tonight. My name is Brent Gibbons. I'm a senior project manager with Mintier Harnish. Up here on the screen are three individuals who are here with us tonight. Jim Harnish is the principal and owner of Mintier Harnish. He will serve as the project director for the overall update, which we'll get into a moment. It's a few different components. I will serve as the project manager for this update. And we also have Jordan Cowell here as well, who's the assistant project manager. I want to give you just a little background on Mintier Harnish. We're a planning consulting firm based out of the city of Sacramento. Our bread and butter is general plans. We also focus on housing element updates, zoning ordinance updates and zoning codes, development codes, and then other regional planning efforts as they come forth. So we're excited to be here tonight with the city of San Ramon moving forward with this process and hope to get some feedback after the presentation. So Minter Harnish is the lead consultant, but we're not the only ones working on this project. So on this slide here, we have the list of our teaming partners. We have Fair and Piers. Fair and Piers will handle all of the traffic, circulation, and mobility portions of this project. We have Rincon Consultants. Rincon will focus on the environmental portions of the general plan. They'll also be leading the climate action plan effort, and they will be assisting with the housing element. We have VTA, Veronica Tam Associates. Veronica Tam will be leading the housing element effort in conjunction with Rincon. That's your 6-cycle housing element. We'll touch on it a bit later. And then lastly, we have the Nadelson Dale Group, and they'll be focusing on economic development, specifically the retail and market analysis for San Ramon and the overall valley, and how that plays into the general plan effort and what effects COVID may have had on the retail market. Next slide. So just want to go over an overview of what we're going to be looking at the meeting tonight. So I'll provide a brief overview on the general plan update, and I use the term brief because it's going to go by pretty quick. The meat of this meeting tonight is primarily focused on the retail market analysis as well as the housing element. So the general plan is the smaller of the components as part of this effort. So I'm going to breeze through that. So don't be alarmed if we go pretty quick. Then we'll touch on the overview of the current state of retail economics. That'll be led by Roger Dale. We'll touch on the 6-cycle housing element, recent changes to legislation, implications, and what that means for the community. That'll be led by Veronica Tam. And then we'll wrap it up with a more focus on some outreach efforts and the community vision and framework, which will be led by Jordan. Next slide, please. So the general plan update. Next one. So the current general plan for the city of San Ramon, adopted in 2015, is actually in great shape. So the policies and programs are still applicable today as they were at the point of adoption. The real need for this general plan update, and it's more of a technical nature, is to address new state legislation. It seems as though Sacramento is doling out new legislation on a weekly basis. So we want to make sure that your general plan is fully compliant with all new laws that have come into effect since prior adoption. So we want to make sure all of that, including new emerging trends and issues, are addressed as part of this update. Now, I'd mentioned at the beginning that this is not just a general plan update. There are several components to this. So we have a general plan, we have a climate action plan, otherwise known as a CAP. So there's an update to that. And we also have a zoning ordinance amendments that'll be at the tail end of the project. And then lastly, our housing element for our 6-cycle is included in this as well. So that's a multifaceted project, and we're aiming for a full completion by the end of 2022. So that'll be December of next year. Move my camera forward. The sun's coming in. There we go. Next slide. So the general plan update is primarily driven by the 6-cycle housing element. So we want to ensure that the RENA that Veronica Tam will touch on in a few moments is adequately covered through your land use and circulation diagram moving forward, and that we have up-to-date goals and policies which reflect current state legislation for housing. So this is a bit different. Some communities update their general plans every 15 to 20 years, and it's just a regular cycle. But in this case, the 6-cycle is triggering this update because there are some substantial legislative changes we want to ensure that are in your general plan and are consistent with state law. As part of this, I do want to point out that the review of the general plan is technical in nature, and it's not going to have any changes on your urban growth boundary or overall element framework. So the actual elements as they exist today, they'll remain in that order and that title. There'll just be some modifications to some of the policies and programs within them. Next slide. So just going to go over the project timeline. This is a 9-phase project. We just started earlier this summer with a project initiation, rolled into phase 2, which is our assets, issues, and opportunities. And as part of that initial discussion, we had a community meeting or community workshop where we gathered some initial feedback and ideas on what the community was thinking expectation-wise for this process moving forward. The 2 orange bubbles on your screen, that's phase 3 and phase 4, we're currently there. So we're working on an existing conditions portion of the project, which tees up all the data and analytical information needed to proceed with the update. And then now we're going into the housing element process. So those two are going to happen simultaneously at this time. Phase 5 and phase 6, that's the general plan and the climate action plan. Those two are starting up within the next month. So this is a very rigorous project, very rigorous schedule. Technically, phases 3 through 6 are all running on the same track, and we'll get into a schedule discussion a bit later. Phase 7, that's our environmental review. If you're familiar with this process, we have to check everything against CEQA just to ensure that there are no significant impacts. And if there are any, provide the mitigation and the monitoring for them. And we all hope for is phase 8, that's adoption. So we all want to make it to that end, which is December of 22. And then phase 9, that's our technical zoning code update. That'll trail. That's not a comprehensive code update. The technical update means that any programs that come out of your general plan or come out of your climate action plan or your housing element, we want to make sure that those are then reflected in your code. And there are statutory requirements to making sure those are updated in a timely manner. Next slide. I just want to provide a little bit on the outreach front. It's always important when you have a plan with this many facets and of this scale that the community is involved in as many points as possible. So here on the screen, I just outlined just a few efforts that are consultant-led. One of them was a joint study session we held back in July, just a few months ago. That was to introduce the project and provide an overview. In September, we held a virtual community workshop that touched on the multiple elements of the project, laid out the project website, what to expect next, and how community members can participate through this effort. The second study session, that's tonight. So we're providing you an additional update on where we are in the project, a deeper dive into some of the components, so housing and the retail analysis, and then we'll wrap it up with a quick discussion on the general plan vision and framework moving forward. Now, I say that these are consultant-led because this is a two-prong effort. Unlike most general plans, you have a very involved staff. And as part of this, we're collaborating with your city staff to try to produce the best amount of outreach as possible through this effort. So while we are leading some of these study sessions and more formal meetings, city staff is taking the lead on city commission and committee meetings that are running simultaneously on a whole host of topics. So the next slide. And I will explain a bit more of that, and I'll have Cindy jump in and explain a bit more about what is entailed as part of those. But real quick, we did put together a community survey that's been out since September 15th. It runs all the way through October 31st. If you haven't had an opportunity to fill that out, I invite you to. It's on the Plan San Ramon website. That's plansanramon.com. It's a multi-questionnaire that gets into concerns and issues over housing. Where should land uses end up? What does the community envision San Ramon looking like over the next decade or so? So I think it's really important. This will take the temperature of the community. Up until yesterday, we had over 227 responses. And our plan is to bring that survey back at a future council and future commission meeting, and where you can see all the results of that survey for transparency issues as well. So look forward to seeing that. That's coming down the pipe. Next slide. So Cindy, would you like to explain how city staff is leading the committee and commission outreach?
Sure. So as a number of the commission and council has probably seen on the meetings and notices page, staff has been to a number of city committees and commission meetings over the course of September. We have done outreach at these particular committees listed here to solicit feedback on particular portions of topics related to these committees, and ask for feedback on comments they may have in their area expertise on the general plan. The feedback we received ranged from, comments about COVID impact to businesses, to long-term outlook for open space and how to address those in the general plan policies, and then comments about how to look at traffic and vehicle miles traveled, and this transition from level of service to VMTs now when we are evaluating projects. And so we've been to a number of committees and as well as commissions. The list continues through October here. We've also done some outreach to at community events such as the Health and Wellness Expo that was held on October 9th. And some of you may have seen Ryan at the Culture and Community. He had a booth at the event this last Sunday, handing out flyers, soliciting input, encouraging people to get on the plansanramon.com page to provide comments and fill out the survey. So we've been doing quite a bit of work just to get the word out on the general plan, trying to solicit feedback, and getting a lot of committee and commission specific comments as it relates to the general plan update.
Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. Just for the commission and councils, just some more background information. All of those comments that come in from those committee and commission meetings are going to be forwarded through the process, and we'll evaluate each of those when we're looking at each of the different components of the plan. So it's really, I work on a lot of different general plans, and I would say the collaborative relationship here and the amount of outreach that we're pulling together as part of this effort is pretty impressive. So we're excited to see where all of these comments come in and how we can integrate them throughout the entire process. There were two pieces I want to touch on before we switch gears into another component of this overall update. And this has to do with general plan policies, programs, and then goals. So currently, as part of the general plan effort, city staff is reviewing and evaluating existing general plan goals and policies. And this is mainly in part to ensure that if some programs have been completed since the prior adoption, that those are removed. If there are successful policies that are still applicable today, that those continue forward. So that's one piece of the process behind the scenes that's moving forward as part of the general plan. Next slide. And then going back to where the schedule was, we're currently working on phase 3, which is the existing conditions and trends. And our team right now is pulling together what's known as an existing conditions and trends workbook. If you're familiar with general plans, they typically include what's known as a background report. And a background report is the first major deliverable of any general plan effort. And what it does is it looks at existing conditions on the ground today. So 2020, 2021 within San Ramon. As part of this effort, we're providing more of a streamlined document. Background reports are typically very thick. They're about 300 pages. We want something that the community can easily pick up and read, has a lot of graphics, a lot of data that is easily digestible and understandable so that everyone's on the same page moving forward with this project. So this workbook we're going to be pulling together will provide future context for policy decisions by both the commission and the council, and also kind of gives background and history of where San Ramon was, where it is currently, and then where it's heading, just based on projections. This report should be out for public review in the first of the year, so January. So keep posted on that. When it does go out, we will coordinate with city staff to provide ample noticing so the community knows that this document is out for review. It'll also be posted to our project website. So I know that was a lot. That covers the general plan component of this effort. We're now going to switch gears and briefly talk about the climate action plan. And I'm going to ask Jim Harnish if he can unmute and walk us through the background of the climate action plan and what to expect.
Well, thanks, Brent. This is my cameo appearance. I just have a couple of slides. I just wanted to touch on the climate action plan. That's not the focus of the meeting tonight. You've heard a lot about that before. It's a very important component project, and so we wanted to mention that as we lead into the discussion of the retail market analysis and the housing element. But you are very familiar with the climate action plan. There are plans to reduce GHG emissions and primarily for city and counties, it's primarily focused on your policies and development approvals. Next slide, please. And so, again, I'm telling you, mentioning things that you already know, why it's so important. The city's committed to reducing GHG emissions. The underlying purpose of this is to update the climate action plan to meet the 2030 goals and hopefully reach carbon neutrality by 2045. The climate action plan we've initiated the early stages of that. It really is going to get underway in the next 2 or 3 months. It's dependent on some preliminary technical analysis that we're doing before we can really launch fully into that. So next year is really the year that the climate action plan will be in high gear. We'll have a number of outreach opportunities, connect with you and the community about choices that the city has about reducing GHG emissions. But I just wanted to touch on this briefly, just so you were aware that it's connected to these, the other key pieces, general plan, housing element. And it's, this is a challenging project given these 3 major components, and we're working closely with your staff to make sure that they're coordinated and are proceeding along parallel paths. Of course, then as Brent mentioned before, the CEQA analysis towards the end of the project will then be an analysis for all 3 projects, a program EIR for.
Jim, let me put you on pause a minute. Scott, is your question about this, or you just are waiting for first in line?
This is a question about this slide specifically.
Okay.
Jim, the 2045 goal is 100% below the 1990 greenhouse gas emission level. 100% below the 1990 would be 0. If you had, say, 1,000 tons and you want to be 100% below that, you have to go to 0 to be. That's kind of misleading. 100% reduction is a reduction from X to 0.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that isn't the expectations to reduce GHG to 0. So we'll have to modify that slide.
Well, wait a minute. Before you modify it, Jim, make sure of the legislation. It's 100% of the 1990 level if we have reached the 1990 level.
It makes no difference what level is your base. If you're 100% below it, you've gone to 0.
Now listen to this a minute. If you're 100% below the 1990 level and your initial goal, where we actually are right now, is not at the 1990 level, but above it, it's true. It's still correct. The problem is, Scott, you are correct. And it was supposed to be 80%. And I don't know when, and I don't have SB 32 in front of me. But so the question really is it this 100% below the 1990 levels, and statewide, not Bay Area, statewide, we haven't reached the 1990 levels. So they're trying some silly game to make it actually turn out to be 80% below the 1990 level. That's your question, Jim. You don't have to answer it tonight. It might just be simple, exactly what Scott's asking, and it's 80% instead of 100. Because that's misleading as heck. I'd say, okay, we're going to 0. Well, we're never going to 0.
Well, I appreciate you letting me off the hook, because our RINCON team members are leading the CAP effort, and I'm not the one to answer the technical questions. So, but we can get back to you. I'll talk to them and we can bring some comments back to you.
Yeah, it's just the math on anything. If you have 100% decrement, it's 0.
Yep, I agree.
Yep, and that's not the intention. So go ahead. Scott, I'm sorry, I can't see. I put the box in front of you. You have more?
No.
Okay. You clean that one up, Jim, and keep right on going.
Oh, well, no, that's the end of my report. It was
I
very
bet.
So very swift, very swift.
Okay, let's have questions of staff or the consultants, starting with the commissioners.
Oh, I'm sorry, through the mayor.
Yes.
We do have about 20 or so additional slides after the climate action plan. So,
Oh, well, then keep going. I'm sorry, staff. I thought you turned it to him and it was over.
okay,
So let me know when you're finished, Cindy, and keep right on going.
great, thanks.
Perfect. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna transition into what I had mentioned earlier is really the meat of this evening, which gets into the retail and economic discussion, not only for the city, but regionally, and what the implications mean for this plan and future goals and policies. And then we're going to get into the 6th cycle housing element. So we have Roger Dale with us tonight with Nadelson Dale, and I'm going to hand it over to Roger, and he's going to walk us through this section of the presentation. So Roger, take it away.
Thank you, Brent, and good evening, Mayor Hudson and members of the council and commission. Excited to be with you this evening to talk about the economic development components of the general plan update. And specifically this evening, I'd like to focus on retail market trends and how they affect the general plan and land use planning process. And even looking specifically at how COVID has further impacted retail market trends and other land uses, and again, how that might relate to the general plan. And then finally, I'd like to briefly touch on some other economic development issues that we'll be looking at as part of this process. Next slide, please. So it's a timely period to be looking at retail development issues as part of this general plan update. And many communities across the country are facing the same types of challenges and issues. And this is a good time to be thinking about those as part of your general plan process. As you're all well aware, retail has been significantly impacted over the past 20 years by a gradual but continual shift to online shopping or e-commerce. And that has put pressure on a lot of retail brick and mortar operations, and a number of retail chain stores have gone through either bankruptcies where they've closed all their stores or significant downsizings. And the net result of that from the standpoint of land use is that shopping centers have fewer tenants to select from or target as occupants of their properties. And while we can certainly say that some retail categories have been more impacted by others, more susceptible to competition from online sales, but I would also say that there are a few that are completely immune, and we're seeing even more of that, have seen even more of that during the pandemic. So from a land use perspective, the implications are that the brick and mortar type retail facilities in most communities will have a smaller footprint in the future. And not only will it be smaller, but the mix of tenants and uses is likely to be different and shifting more towards services and what's often called experiential retail. In other words, things that can't be readily done online and do need a physical presence. And this has implications both challenging and I would say opportunities for revitalization of older shopping centers and looking at other mixes of land uses that can be accommodated on those sites to revitalize them from a financial perspective and also maintain what we can as far as a retail footprint in the community. Next slide, please. So this gives you a sense of what has happened in San Ramon as well as in the larger East Bay region and the state of California as a whole in terms of taxable sales. And in this case, we've looked at it on a per capita basis. And this is about a 10-year trend from 2011 through 2020. And it's been adjusted for inflation. So these show the real dollar changes in per capita sales tax for the three places we've looked at. And the San Ramon trend is indicated in the green line in the lower part of the chart. So the first thing that we notice is that San Ramon's line is quite a bit lower than the state and the East Bay region lines. And that simply means that on a per capita basis or per household basis, you have a lower number of sales tax dollars. And that's really translates into what we call leakage. You've got a certain percentage of your resident retail demand is being spent outside this community. And so you're capturing less of that than the larger area benchmarks, which would be the state and the East Bay region. The other thing we notice is that there has been despite the trend that I mentioned of a shift towards e-commerce, up until about 2018, there was still a gradual, for the state and for the East Bay, a gradual upward trend in sales tax per capita. And then about 2018 or 2019, you can see the trend downward for the East Bay and the state, and which accelerated during the pandemic, of course. For San Ramon, it's been the decline started sooner and has been more severe during the pandemic. So you can see that whereas from about 2013 through about 2018 or 19, the region and the state were continuing to go up, San Ramon's trend really went down steadily until about 2017, gradually increased a little bit to 2018 and 2019, but then dropped off fairly dramatically during the pandemic. And of course, it's a matter of speculation at this point, how much of that impact from COVID will permanently accelerate the trend of retail sales decline in brick and mortar facilities. If we could take a look at the next slide. This is a chart that is more recent than the numbers I showed you for the city. That the city level data are available from the state up through the year end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. But this chart is a more recent trend line for the Oakland metropolitan statistical area, which is the combined area of Alameda and Contra Costa counties. So it's not, this more recent data is not available for the city, but I think it gives us a general trend of categories of retail spending that were significantly impacted by the pandemic and others which actually in some ways benefited from it. If you can look at the chart, it starts basically in early 2020, right before the pandemic. And then you can see the blue line, which is entertainment and recreation spending. So things that were clearly impacted by being shut down during the pandemic period, and things that many people were very reluctant to return to, even now that in some cases those types of businesses have reopened. So you can see just a dramatic drop off in March of 2020, kind of fluctuated up and down towards about June of 2020, but still below where it was prior to the pandemic, and then dropped again in the summer of 2020 and up, or excuse me, 2021, and then up again towards the end of the summer, and then we've seen a drop in the most recent weeks. So overall, that type of spending, entertainment and recreation, is still just barely back to where it was prior to the pandemic, and then in the recent few weeks, it's dropped off again. The red line at the top is overall retail spending. So this includes some categories that have been significantly impacted and others that have in some cases actually benefited from the pandemic. But again, you see a sharp drop off in the early part of the pandemic, but then a gradual but not steady increase to a point that now overall retail is above where it was. It's about 25% above where it was at the beginning of the pandemic. If we go to the next slide, we break this down a little further in terms of specific types of retail that have been most significantly impacted, either positively or negatively. If we look at grocery spending, that's the red line at the top, you can see it actually jumped way up during the pandemic, which I know is no surprise to any of us, because people were simply not able to eat in restaurants as much, or were converting to takeout food, but much more spending was happening in grocery stores for food and other basic essential supplies. That kind of leveled off after a few weeks, but overall the grocery category stayed well above where it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and to date it's still about 22% of where it was prior to the pandemic. Then below that, we see restaurants and hotels. And again, this is a story of the types of businesses that were most severely impacted by shutdowns. And you can see the dramatic drop at the beginning of the pandemic, a gradual increase through the end of 2020, and then a little bit of a drop again after the new year, but then a gradual increase again, but still at this point, just barely above where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. So, and the reason I'm showing these to you is that the trends are generally showing improvement. It's still a question of a matter of speculation, I would say, to indicate how much of the COVID-related impacts to retail will remain permanent. Certainly, there's a lot of thinking that in the industry that we're in a period of gradual shifting towards online sales. The pandemic certainly encouraged more people to do that, and we would expect that people will continue that, and this may accelerate that trend. Nevertheless, overall, we're showing a stabilization and a recovery of these sectors. And this is part of what we'll be looking at as part of the general plan update, is how much brick and mortar retail space will the city of San Ramon need in future years? And we don't have that analysis completed yet. We're just starting that part of the process. But a couple of things to keep in mind. Although we know that in general, retail is going to have a smaller footprint in most communities, there's still that background issue of leakage from San Ramon, which means that a lot of potential demand is leaking to other communities. And that generally we interpret as an opportunity for new development. We're going to look at that very carefully, of course, as part of this process, because even theoretically, when there are new development opportunities, when there are fewer and fewer retail chain stores to serve as tenants or anchors for shopping centers, it makes it challenging to fully capture a community's resident demand. So I
got a minute, Roger. I see a hand just dying to jump in, and I'll bet it's on this particular slide. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yes, we're glad to talk about that.
Can you separate out restaurants from hotels? Because
unfortunately not in this data
restaurants
source.
have recovered and hotels have not.
You are correct. That is generally the trend we're seeing. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's very difficult to get current data at the city level without going out and surveying individual businesses. In terms of getting official data from the state, it's basically a year old. The data source that we created these slides from is right up to the current last few weeks, but unfortunately there's limitations as far as the way they break out the different categories. So to respond to your question, we unfortunately don't have the ability to break out these data between restaurants and hotels. It's just a general trend that we'll be considering, and we will be doing as part of our process some of our own modeling of that, so we'll look more closely at the San Ramon data that are available and supplement it with these things to try to answer that question, but we haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Sridhar, is this on this slide, or can you wait to the end?
This slide, yes.
Okay.
Roger, regarding the restaurant sales for online, like DoorDash or any other online, is that considered as online sales, or is it still your graph that represents that online sale also as part of this restaurant sale?
In general, that would be it would be a separate category. In this chart, I believe they would be mixed in, but again, there are limitations on this data source, and that's a question that we will be looking at more carefully as we get into the actual numbers. But yes, if it was DoorDash and it was DoorDash delivering to or delivering from what would otherwise be a brick and mortar restaurant, that still counts as a restaurant sale. What has happened in some communities during the pandemic, though, are the development of what are called ghost kitchens. If any of you have heard that term, it's basically a restaurant that is opened with the intent of never being a storefront. So it's just basically a kitchen that will only function as a delivery service. And that I would put into a separate category because it doesn't generate demand from a real estate perspective for space to accommodate that as a storefront business. So those are all great questions, things that are a little challenging to sort through with the data that are available now, but we will be, as I mentioned, doing some of our own estimates of that through this process to get a better perspective on what the real impact of these trends is in terms of demand for future development opportunities in the city.
Keep going, unless you got another one, Sridhar.
One more slide.
Okay.
So just to kind of recap what we just touched on, how has COVID really affected the real estate markets? And I would say that the jury is still out on this because we're seeing the recovery happen as we speak, but we can kind of speculate based on trends that are available now that it did accelerate and potentially on a permanent basis the shift to e-commerce. I think that that's a reality even before the pandemic. If anything, this has caused that to accelerate. How significant that is for San Ramon is what we will be looking at more carefully as we move further into the process. We know that there are restaurants that close temporarily and there are restaurants that close permanently as part of that impact. And I mentioned the concept of the trend of ghost kitchens. That's potentially a long-term change in the way food services are delivered. We used to think of restaurants as being a type of business that was somewhat immune from impacts from e-commerce, but now we're seeing maybe that's not always going to be the case. Shifting to other land uses besides retail, office demand is another question mark with the shift to remote work. And again, we're expecting that much of that will be temporary and people will begin to or are beginning to return to their offices. But we note from real estate market data that the Bay Area has been among the nation's slowest region for workers to return. So I think it's fair to say that very urban areas where people previously concentrated for employment type activities may see a dispersal of that type of a concentration in further outlying areas, potentially including places like communities like San Ramon, might pick up some of that demand that in a more suburban setting. We've definitely seen a surge in some types of industrial demand, especially warehousing and logistics. Again, kind of correlates right with the uptick in online shopping and other online services. That's in effect, you can think of industrial is the new retail. If you're going to be shopping online, the physical presence of that activity is no longer a storefront, but it's a warehouse where that is serviced from. And as someone mentioned earlier, hotel demand has been very dramatically impacted, especially for business travel. In certain communities where there's a strong attraction of tourist type hotel use, that continued in many cases very strongly through the pandemic, but business travel, along with all other types of face-to-face business interactions, has gone down dramatically, of course, and that has affected that type of hotel demand. And I think that overall, this trend, this impact would cause us to rethink what we've talked about previously as live-work relationships. We may see more opportunities for people to live or to work closer to where they live. And that can be an opportunity for some types of communities in terms of retaining more of its employment, its resident employment, and also retaining more of the retail spending that goes along with employment. And it can also have implications for all kinds of land use decisions, for example, including something I alluded to earlier, which is the way that many communities are rethinking the need for retail projects and retail space. In many cases, communities are reconceiving those as mixed use areas that would include employment uses, shopping and entertainment, as well as on-site housing. So these are things that we look forward to looking at in more detail as this general plan process progresses. And I'd like to have one more slide, please.
Sabina, was your question on this slide, or do you want to wait to?
It was. So going back to your last point, right? Rethinking of live-work relationships. One of the things we've seen is people moving to suburbia. And there's this whole concept of, and we've obviously our prices have gone up because we're gaining residents and it's becoming competitive. And so are we putting that in the mix and the blurring lines between what we're now calling the urban suburban, where, like you said, thinking of live-work relationships?
Yes, that's absolutely the type of thing that we're thinking about. Is that can be an opportunity. You're getting more residents who are going to be staying in the city during the day because they're going to be potentially working closer to home or even from home. So therefore, they're potentially going to be able to spend more money, creates business opportunities, and in some cases, even people who are working from home part of the time will need some type of office facilities for occasional use. And we would again expect that suburban communities would be the beneficiaries of that type of a trend. So those are all things that will be factored into our market analysis.
Thank you.
One more, Roger.
One more slide. Thank you. And so just to recap, these are the things that you can look forward to as far as work products from our part of the general plan update, an in-depth retail market analysis. And all the questions you've asked tonight have been great because they're exactly the types of things we're going to be looking at as part of this study. And it helps us to hear your perspectives on that. So we appreciate that. But the market analysis will be practical in the sense that we're going to drill it down to potential opportunity sites, either existing shopping centers that might be opportunities for revitalization or other places where infill retail development might happen. We're also going to be looking at demand projections for office, industrial, and hotel uses. And again, all the questions you asked about that are very pertinent because those are the types of things that we'll be adjusting the way we normally forecast demand. We're now going to be adjusting for the types of trends that we've just talked about. As part of the housing finance strategy, which you're going to hear more about housing in a moment, our firm will be doing a financial analysis, or what we call a pro forma, to look at the way that city land use policies and development standards can potentially have a positive impact on the types of housing production that you'd like to see in the city. In other words, are there ways that we can rethink in terms of allowable densities or other factors that might make it more feasible for a developer, either for profit or nonprofit, to develop targeted housing types and things that might be accommodated in the general plan update. And then we will be looking at this not only from a land use perspective, but really from a broader economic development perspective. What are the broad opportunities for business growth and job creation to create the types of employment opportunities that sustain the cost of life in the Bay Area and in San Ramon? And all of that will eventually be translated into an economic development element of a series of policies within the general plan that target land uses and land use policies that take advantage of the market opportunities for retail development, office, industrial, hotel development, as well as the related employment opportunities for your existing and potentially future residents. So I want to thank you for the chance to speak with you this evening. Glad to answer any questions now or later in the evening. And I believe now that Veronica Tam is going to talk about the housing element.
Right, so we're going to shift into the housing element discussion. This is going to focus on the sixth cycle and how this differs from the fifth. There's a lot of new legislation and a lot of time implications for statutory deadlines that Veronica will walk with. So Veronica, take it away.
Great, thank you. You are updating the rest of your general plan together, but I think the housing element is a little bit different from the rest of the general plan. There are some key kind of components of the housing element. One, the housing element has to be updated every 8 years. Usually your general plan has a longer horizon, 20 years, 25 years, but the housing element has to be updated every 8 years. It is a mandated element of the general plan. What also sets the housing element apart from the rest of the general plan is that it's subject to very stringent statutory requirements that are in the government code. General plans have guidelines, but the housing element has statutory requirements. What is also different about the housing element is that it has to be reviewed by a state agency for compliance with state law. The agency responsible for that is the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, and you will be hearing about, HCD, this agency, pretty frequently throughout this whole process of updating the housing element. There is a critical component of HCD's review. When we send the housing element to the state for review, there's one critical component of the housing element is the regional housing needs assessment. We'll go into that a little further, what it means and what are the obligations. Another thing that is different about the housing element is that it has a statutory deadline. You must adopt the housing element within 120 days from the statutory deadline, which is January 31st, 2023 for the Bay Area. So that's something that is different for the general plan. You can choose to update at any time and you don't have really a timeline for it. But for the housing element, these are really stringent requirements that we have to meet. Next slide. So just looking at the housing element, the contents of the housing element are pretty regulated as well. As I mentioned before, it's codified in the government code. We have to look at the housing needs in your community, not only the current needs, but also the projected needs in the future, based on demographic trends, the housing market conditions, and special needs groups. Those are some of the key analysis. Per state law, the special needs populations are the elderly, the disabled, large households, households that has 5 or more members, female-headed households, homeless, and farm workers. Those are under the state law considered to be special needs populations because of the unique characteristics. They may have more difficulty in finding housing in any community. We also need to look at your past accomplishments. I think earlier in the presentation that Brent mentioned that Cindy is actually doing a review of the city's progress in achieving some of the goals and policies. The housing element dives a little bit further into program by program. In the housing element, has the city been able to achieve it? The programs continue to be appropriate? What modifications needs to be done in the upcoming housing plan? We do need to look at constraints and opportunities available in addressing your housing needs. Constraints, we look at governmental constraints, market constraints, environmental and infrastructure constraints. Now, you don't have a whole lot of influence over the market or even the environment, but you do have influence over governmental constraints. The rules and the regulations that you enact as a local jurisdictions, are they considered to be constraining to housing development? That's something that you're legally obligated to mitigate if your development standards or processes are considered to be constraining. And Roger mentioned earlier about that he will be looking at a housing finance pro forma to see whether there needs to be adjustment in terms of maybe your development standards in order to make housing pencil in out in your community. That would be all kind of integrated into the whole housing element analysis. Then we need to look at resources available to address your needs. The key resource we have to look at is whether you have adequate capacity in terms of land use policies and zoning regulations to accommodate your regional housing needs allocation. Again, we'll go into that a little further, but that's the key analysis of resources. But we certainly look at financial resources. We also look at public-private partnerships, because as a local jurisdiction, you cannot function as a developer. To facilitate housing in your community, you rely on the public partner, the private partner partnerships that you have with for-profit and nonprofit developers. And one key change to the housing element is the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement. This is some new state law passed in 2017 that requires that we looked at the whole housing issues, needs, and where you're going to have housing from an equity lens in terms of equal access to opportunities. So we need to look at segregation, access to opportunities, anti-displacement, people with disproportionate needs, and mobility, housing mobility, how to promote different types of housing that allow people to move around in your community. All these analysis kind of put together as part of your housing element that culminates in the housing plan. What are your actions? What are your programs that you are going to implement over the next 8 years in order to address the needs that you have? Next slide. So since 2017, there's been a lot of state laws that the state passed in order to address the housing needs, because housing is recognized as a statewide crisis, and that we need to address housing from a supply perspective. A lot of these bills really addressed focuses on removing governmental constraints and improving production. I'm not going to go into details about these, and the governor on September 28th signed another 30 new housing bills. So that's a lot of that is not even included on this list because the actual interpretation of those are to be determined. But one bill that really impact the housing element this round is AB 1397. It sets really stringent standards as what constitute a site as feasible for accommodating your housing needs over the next 8 years. It has to be a certain size, cannot be too small. It has to be certain standard density. It has to also have realistic capacity over the 8 years in terms of developing. And another related state law is SB 166, monitoring no net loss. As your sites are being developed, you have to make sure that continuously that you have enough capacity for the remaining of your RHNA throughout the planning period. This is particularly important, and I guess that's also important why Rogers, the economic development piece would be important, is that if you rely on mixed use, for example, and mixed use that's come back with a lot of non-residential development, then that means it diminishes the opportunity for residential development. If that is the case, then we need to make sure that there is enough capacity in your mixed use to accommodate not only residential development, but mixed use development, but also 100% non-residential development. So what is that balance would really rely on some of the analysis done as part of the economic development piece. As I mentioned before, affirmatively furthering fair housing is an important piece of the legislation, probably the most important piece of legislation passed in 2017. We need to look at how your housing plan, your land use plan facilitate integration, and make sure that you do not over-concentrate low-income housing, and that you put housing in areas that have access to resources and opportunities, and you also address households with disproportionate needs. These are households that may have a high cost burden. These households may be overcrowded right now. So how do you address those needs from the lens of equity? Next slide. A lot of the, as I mentioned before, a lot of the recent legislation also focus on removing governmental constraints. How do you remove constraints to development? One of the most recent ones signed by the governor, I think that was on September 14, that was signed by the governor, was SB 9. SB 9 requires local jurisdictions to permit the splitting of single-family lots into 2, and then each lot would ultimately allow an additional ADU or duplex. So the actual impact of this legislation is not known at this time. In Southern California, where I'm doing a lot of housing element also right now, because their housing element cycle precedes yours, HCD is recommending not utilizing this piece of legislation at this point because the impact is unknown, the interpretation is unknown. They anticipate it more like an ADU kind of situation that you need to take a look at your trend and see how much that could happen. But we will be continuing our discussion with HCD and see what type of analysis that they would require in order for us to look at the potential implication of SB 9 and account for it in the housing element. That is something that I still have to continue to work with the state on. Reducing fees and relaxing development standards, particularly with objective standards. SB 330, that's something that's required under state law. Streamlining the processes of approval, as I mentioned before, objective design standards, anything that would improve certainty of the development approval process. Those are some of the legislation passed by the state. Expanding housing options, and that also again relates to the AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing. How do you expand the types of housing available in your community that would address the diverse needs in your community? ADUs being one, supportive housing for persons with disability. Low barrier navigation center, this is a type of housing for formerly homeless that allow them to be living in an area where they are waiting for permanent housing. Housing on religious facility properties, this is a very popular trend in California right now. We definitely will be looking at that. This particular bill allows churches to partner with nonprofits and provide housing on their parking areas, and or maybe even convert some of their areas, their lot into housing, and they would enjoy some parking relief under state law. We were just talking to some other developers in the Bay Area. They worked on 2 church-related projects in Berkeley. So that's certainly something that's pretty popular these days. There's been numerous bills about expanding the density bonus programs, including providing density bonus for student housing, and also increasing density bonus for housing that's near transit, and also projects that are 100% affordable. So all of these recent changes to state law in the last 2-3 years have been focusing on expanding opportunities and productions and reducing constraints. Next slide. So now let's talk a little bit about the whole concept of the regional housing needs allocation. This is the most critical component of the state's review, probably most difficult, along with the affirmatively furthering fair housing. Virtually no jurisdiction would have a housing element approved by the state if you're unable to meet this requirement. Currently, your draft regional housing needs allocation for San Ramon is at 5,111 units. And this is your planning goal. This is something that you must provide capacity for with land use planning, meaning zoning and land use destination and development standards, that you must have that adequate capacity through your land use element and your zoning code to accommodate that. This regional housing needs allocation really starts from by definition, it's not housing that is generated from within the city of San Ramon. It's your share of the region's housing needs as part of the region, your responsibility of the whole region's housing needs and being part of the region. It started off from a relatively top-down process with the state projecting how much growth is needed in the entire state. And that number was 3.5 million units over the next 10 years or so. And Southern California got the bulk of the 3.5 million units. For the Bay Area, the state allocated from, by region. For the Bay Area, you get 441,176 units. And this number won't change. This is a number that is set in stone right now. And for Contra Costa County, you get about 11% of the Bay Area total, and San Ramon has about 10% of the Contra Costa County total. This 441,000 unit is not changeable, and I don't think the Contra Costa number would change 49,000, but we don't know. Right now, you're going through a appeal process, but my understanding from some of the appeal hearings, not many jurisdictions, if any, would really get a reduction. But it's a zero-sum game that if one jurisdiction get a reduction, another jurisdiction will get an increase. So the total number will not change. Let's go to the next slide. This whole regional housing needs allocation also is divided into income categories. Very low income people who make less than 50% of the area median income. Low income for people who are up to 80%. Moderate income is up to 120% and above moderate income. And it's divided into 4 different buckets that you must meet each and every one of these buckets. It doesn't mean that you're going to build the units in these income categories, because it costs a lot of money to subsidize a low-income housing unit or a very low-income housing unit. You would not have all the money to do that, and no private market developer would do that voluntarily, and affordable housing developers would not have enough money to do all of that. But what this means is that, again, you need to do that based on land use planning and development standards. You have to have land use that are designated at a high enough density that is potentially feasible, so that the project will financially pencil out if there is an affordable housing project. I'll give you an example. For example, if your density is too low, the subsidies ultimately that needs to make an affordable housing project is going to be very high. And that project is not going to be competitive if they want to go to the state or the federal government to apply for funding, because the subsidy is too high. So your density has to be high enough so that with a reasonable amount of subsidies, the project and an affordable housing project could pencil in. So this income distribution is not suggesting that you will have the money or that you will be actually building all of these units in this particular income distribution, but you have to have a land use plan with density ranges that make it possible for such housing to occur if funding is available. Next slide. So this is just to give you some idea about how much money are we talking about? I think the whole concept about very low income households, sometimes people may be still in a very antiquated concept of who are the low income folks. If you look at the Bay Area in Contra Costa County, you can be making up to $110,000 for a household of 4 and still consider a low-income households. These are certainly hardworking people with good jobs, but still not making enough to afford housing in the Bay Area because your housing costs are so high. Median income in Contra Costa County is $125,600 for a household of 4. So, if you think about it, a lot of your recent graduate for college grad, and they are still a low income or very low income household. Most of them are probably just a very low income person if you have like a college degree. And so the idea about making housing affordable, really, we are looking at people who are, recent grads, hardworking people who may be doing minimum wage jobs, and a lot of retired people who has limited incomes.
Hold right there a minute, Veronica. Sabina, you have a question of this slide?
Yeah, so my question was, when you say 4-person, is it 4 people together making that much money, or it's a 4-person household?
It's a 4-person household, so it could be a 1 wage earner or 2 wage earners, or like it's just what the state consider. Like if you're a 4-person, if your total household income is this much, you would be considered a low income household, and a lot of times that's what they use to qualify you for programs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next slide. So, we talked a little bit about, income, affordable housing. What does that really mean? And in typical housing policy standards, we look at no more than 30% of your household income on housing as being affordable, because that would leave you enough disposable income for healthcare, for food, and other necessities. But this is almost this threshold may be an achievable threshold for other parts of the country. For California, that is very difficult. Most people spend more than 30%. A lot of people spend way more than 30%. Now, in the city of San Ramon, you have about 33%, a third of your household spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And specifically, about 1/3 of that spent more than 50%. These are the people who are considered to be really, not only are they severely cost burdened, they're most at risk. I think COVID would kind of demonstrate that loss of income or loss of employment would render a lot of these people at risk of becoming homeless, because they're spending 50% of their income on housing. A lot of these households are paycheck to paycheck. They don't have savings. They don't have a safety net. And these are the households that are probably most at risk. About 1/3 of your households pay more than 30%. About 1/8 of your households spend more than 50% of their income on housing. Next slide.
Sridhar, you had a question before we left there?
Yeah, the previous slide. I have a question on the previous slide. So the 33.1% of household experience cost burden, right? So are we talking about the rental, or is it includes rental as well as the mortgage payment, or how that numbers come?
This is total households right now. We do have the breakdown by owner versus renters, which will be presented in the housing element. So we just didn't break down for now. And in terms of a housing policy discussions, the focus is a lot of times is more on the renters, because as an owner, we hate to say it, but they do have the option to sell the home and then have equity, they have the option to become renter. When you're a renter, you get into that situation, you have no other option. And so that's why when it comes to cost burden, a lot of times the emphasis is on lower income households that spend more than 50%. Those are the most at risk segment of your population. When we do the needs assessment of the housing element, we'll dive into more of that in detail.
Thank you.
So meeting your RHNA, your regional housing needs allocation, is going to be a challenge. And it is a challenge for a lot of communities because the RHNA is so much larger than we had experienced in the past. We do have the ability to count accessory dwelling units. In looking at accessory dwelling units though, and I mentioned, kind of alluded to that earlier about SB 9, we cannot say that because you have how many thousands of single family properties that could put an ADU on it, therefore we could have X number of ADUs. ADUs is in the state law that says we can only count it based on trend. So between 2018 and 2021, if you have a lot of potential capacity, but you've only permitted 5 units, ADUs, a year, then we can only assume you can do 5 in the next 8 years, or maybe inflate it a little bit if you work to facilitate that. So we have to, the ADU trend is the only way that we are allowed to account for your RENA. And so based on past trends and maybe some a little bit of an escalation, if we can have like stepped up in terms of efforts and tools that the city would use to facilitate ADUs. The regional housing needs allocation is actually a little different than the housing element plan period. We are able to count projects that are going to begin construction next June or so. So starting from that, we would be able to get credits. If you have projects that are in the pipeline that they're not going to be building or issuing building permits until next June, we could count those towards your next RENA. In fact, we can double count it for your current 5th cycle RENA. We can also count it for the 6th cycle RENA. But those are projects that we kind of have to watch it, because it's kind of like, it's a moving target, projects that may be applying right now, but if they move too faster, then we not count it. If projects that we didn't think that we could count it, but they're being delayed, we could count it. So that's something that we'll be constantly working with your staff to make sure that we get a good accounting of what are the projects that entitled and pending projects that we can credit towards the RENA. Then we need to then look at sites now. We have our ADU trend, we have our credits for pending projects. The rest of your RENA has to be fulfilled with sites. And so we have to look at some of your specific plans, whether they have remaining capacity in those areas. We have to look at residential mixed-use sites, particularly mixed-use sites. You don't necessarily have a lot of residential-only sites. We need to look at your commercial and mixed-use sites. And again, what the economic development element, Roger's work will come in is what is the right balance of land use in your community, given the trend as it relates to jobs creation and your retail trend, your office trend, and all of that. So we certainly would look at what's currently available based on your current general plan and current zoning, but we do anticipate that there will be areas where we need to do some rezoning as part of the general plan and zoning efforts that to create new sites in order to accommodate the RENA. So that would be the next step of our work, and we will be starting that pretty soon. Next slide. I think Brent and Larry mentioned that earlier too. Community outreach is also very important. Also impacted by the AFFH affirmatively furthering fair housing. The housing elements particularly focuses on outreach. We want to make sure that we reach out to the minority population, to low and moderate income population, and particular neighborhoods that may have an issue, that are experiencing housing issues. We will be starting our stakeholder interviews pretty soon, working with the city staff to develop a list of agencies and organizations and developers that we can interview to understand what are the constraints and opportunities, what are the nature and extent of needs in your community. We will have additional community workshops that focuses primarily on housing. And housing advisory committee meetings. We have scheduled some of that too. And in the future, there will be planning commission and city council meetings to kind of go over the process of the housing element. Specifically, the next step that we're going to focus on is identification of the sites for the RENA. Now, this part is extremely technical and as well. We need to identify sites that have realistic development potential for the next 8 years. What does that mean? We have communities that, like sometimes cities say, oh, go ahead and take a look at the Costco sites. It has a large parking lot, but Costco never allows people to put housing on or any uses in their parking lot. So is it a realistic site? We need to make sure that if you identify, sites like that, you need to have communications with key developers or key property owners. A lot of shopping centers are being reimagined these days to put housing in there. Which ones are the ones that may be appropriate in your community? We need to look at a minimum density of 30 units to the acre. That's state law for facilitating lower income housing now, but is 30 units to the acre really adequate? That's a default density established by state law, but Rogers analysis may come back and say, 30 units to the acre really doesn't cut it. And the question too is, we need so much housing if we just go to 30 units to the acre. How much land do we have? Do we have enough capacity? Or should we increase the land, the density in certain neighborhoods or certain areas so that we have more feasibility there? State law also says that a site is not a site if it's less than half an acre for lower income, facilitating lower income housing. That doesn't mean that a site has to be like a single parcel. You can have lot consolidation, but we have to identify areas where there's a potential and feasibility for lot consolidation in order to get to sites that are at least half an acre. The other part that is also very difficult for communities is the by right approval of sites for the RHNA. For sites that are accommodating the lower income RHNA, if it is a site that comes from reusing existing sites that we have in the housing, on the 5th cycle housing element, but they haven't been built on, and you're continuing or reusing that site as potential for your 6th cycle RHNA, that's considered a reuse site. If it's a site to be rezoned, after the statutory deadline, after January 31st, 2023, that's considered a rezone site. These type of sites to accommodate your lower income RHNA is required by state law that you provide for a ministerial process of approving a project. If the project includes 20% affordable units for lower income. And ministerial means no discretionary decision, no public hearings, no CEQA, and design review based on objective design standards only. And these are the requirements if it is for a project that has 20% affordable on these type of sites. So looking at that too, we have to make sure that we have the right balance of sites and pay a little attention to these kind of requirements as well. Next slide. So some critical timeline. As I mentioned before, the housing element is probably the most legally regulated element of the entire general plan. It has strict statutory deadline. The state passed 2 bills recently, AB 215 and AB 1397. Oh, no, AB 1398. That really kind of governs the timeline for the housing element, and kind of going backward with that. We are certainly in the process of updating the housing element right now. The statutory deadline is January 31st, 2023. But we have to adopt it within a, we have a grace period, quote unquote, 120 days, but we'll cover that right now. But before we can do adoption, we have to go through a lot of mandatory steps. The draft housing element has to be available for the public to review it for 30 days. Then the city must take about 10 days, at least 10 days, to respond to the public comments. Make adjustment to your draft housing element before you can submit the draft housing element to the state for their review. The state has 90 days to look at your draft housing element. That they'll come back at the end of the 90-day review, they'll come back with comments. And the requirement for adoption is that you must consider HCD comments before you go to adoption. After you adopt the housing element, there's yet another mandatory review by the state. It's a 60-day review of the adopted housing element. And like I mentioned before, the statutory deadline for the adoption is January 31st, 2023, with a grace period of 120 days that ends May 30th, 2023. This compliance deadline is one that I'm still discussing with the state with the new legislation. The state is working on the legal to discuss how to interpret this compliance deadline. I would actually know better on Monday because I've been communicating with the state. They have a new interpretation. I will know better on Monday what that actually means. But for now, our goal is to get the adoption done by January 31st, 2023. With that, I think I can conclude my presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica. It's all your fault. No. Okay, let's open this up to some questions of staff. We've heard from council members. Anyone on the commission have a question for staff or anyone on the consulting team? And I'm looking, where did my little participant thing go?
Mayor Hudson.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I know Brent was going to come back and just cover the last couple of slides. I can just breeze through them again.
Okay.
So, as Brent has mentioned, we have the website that we've created, theplanceremon.com. There you can check regularly for updates. There's also an opportunity to join the mailing list as well as provide comments on the webpage. And tonight, I think you'll see in the staff report, there's also a component that we're trying to confirm just the current framework that's in the general plan that discusses, the city's overall philosophy and vision for the general plan of maintaining urban growth boundary, growing in a compact urban form, creating mixed-use centers that provide opportunities for services and retail and housing to all be located in neighborhoods where these uses are, providing affordable workforce housing, and then utilizing our specific plans to implement the general plan. So that formally concludes the presentation, and we'd certainly, at this point, I think would take questions from the committee or the commission and the council, but it is a public meeting, and so we'd also be asking for public comments and questions as well this evening.
Well, since everybody on our panel is jumping out there, let me give you two, one for Veronica and one for you. I read this and I could see where there's going to be a question about it. It's just the simplest of things. We're doing an update. We'll also include revisions to policy and narratives. Can you give me an idea what we're talking about in narratives? I mean, when I go down to the bottom of the page, is it going to say, Dave Hudson suggested, what's a narrative, Cindy?
The reference in the staff report to narratives is primarily the history and background as to how we got to where we are. So you'll see perhaps some discussions about specific plan efforts and the process in which we've been updating plans or changes to state law that has required a shift in certain policies. So they're narratives, primarily background information that will go into the plan.
Okay, and I want to go back to something, Veronica, you said you're going to check with HCD. I almost chuckled when you said, well, we don't have a readout. HCD doesn't have a reading on SB 9. They may not have a reading yet, but I seriously doubt that they're not going to have a favorable reading to legislation authored by the Senate Pro Tem. And she's been after this for 2 years that I know of. So if you get something that's different than what I'm leading towards right now, please send a memo out right away. I think the planning commissioners, and I know the city council, I will, because I sit on enough legislative things and just can't wait to see how we're going to put this thing together. But a lot of scary stuff that you just brought up. Any other questions before I open this to the public? When you start talking about build by right, I don't know about you, but that gets my attention real quick. Okay, 2 panelists there. I knew if I talked long enough, I'd get them, but I don't. There's a hand. Sridhar, you're first, then Sabina. Guys first.
This question is more for my understanding. It may go to our planning department. So I see that we always get this 15% of affordable housing for each development or a specific plan that we go with, right? So I'm wondering how we came with that 15%, and also just want to know, is that 15%, is that suitable for all our current arena allocations that the numbers jump so high? Is that still a feasible number, or we need to review that?
Sure, I can try to answer that one. So I think what Councilmember Veros is referring to is the city's inclusionary housing ordinance that was adopted a couple of years ago. You've seen several specific plans that we've updated or in the process of updating that matches that 15% set aside requirement in the inclusionary housing ordinance. That ordinance was developed in part relying on past practice, projects that have been developed in the city and how many units generally can be set aside. Before the city adopted our inclusionary ordinance, a lot of that was done on a negotiation basis. So you would see some projects had 100% affordability, some may have 25%, and some, maybe 5 or 10%. And a lot of that was done through a negotiation process. When we adopted the ordinance, we looked at other cities that are surrounding jurisdictions to compare what an inclusionary policy would be in Ramon that would make us competitive as far as allowing for future development in Ramon, but still creating opportunities where there was a balance of market rate units and affordable units. So there's some state law that's wrapped into that, and trying to get to the RENA that was developed. As you know, our RENA in the last couple of cycles were significantly lower than our current RENA. And so, I think, Veronica can correct me if I'm wrong, but all of that analysis is going to be done as part of this housing element update, and whether or not the 15% inclusionary ordinance as a city is something that we continue to maintain. How effective has it been to develop the housing that we need? And then, what tools can we use as a city to get to our RENA allocation?
Okay. You got another one, Sridhar? Okay.
One more question is, I saw that we are doing a community outreach. I'm just interested to know what are the methods that we are using to get to the community outreach regarding this housing plan as well as the housing element.
So far, our outreach effort has included directly going to community events. So the Run for Education, I spoke with probably 3 dozen or so people who came to the city booth and engaged them in conversations about what our current effort is. We've done a citywide newsletter sent to property owners in the city, the web page, and doing social media news blasts. Even on the marquee, as you drive by City Hall, you'll see advertisements of our current process. But the community vision, the study sessions have included notices to property owners directly We're also going to be in the future doing stakeholder interviews, as Veronica mentioned, and continue the utilizing social media and our mailing lists that we've generated over time to outreach to the community.
Okay. And do we have any benchmark or the ratio how much we want to reach out to so that we can get the feedback from based on our population, current population?
I don't know, Brent, if there is a particular metric of how many responses or public engagement is enough. I don't think that there's a requirement from state law, but the survey, at least as I understand, in some of the jurisdictions that Brent works in, we've had a very high response rate, even though 227 may not seem like a lot when you have a fairly sizable households in San Ramon. It is, at least in this early effort, quite a bit of feedback that we're already receiving just early on in the process.
It is a lot of community feedback when there is technically no deliverable to react to yet. We're still in, I would say we're still in the initiation phase, and we're already receiving that type of feedback. And having that much this early, it has a good trajectory for the remainder of the project. Unlike the general plan does not have any statistical data for how much outreach you should have or should reach or percentage wise. I know the state, as part of the housing element, does mandate specific types of outreach, and Veronica went over that as part of her presentation.
Yeah, if I can also supplement to that response, part of the discussions that we have with Cindy too is to make sure that when you post, I think Cindy mentioned that the city posts about flyers, about workshops in supermarkets and such as that. So we want to make sure that you definitely pick the reach the supermarkets that has the households that are minority, low income, or disproportionate needs. One thing that we didn't look at is something called linguistic isolation. So looking at the population that speaks primarily a different language at home, but we also looked at like what they respond as how well do they speak English as well. And in general, your community has very little linguistic isolation issues. So but still, we wanted to make sure that we reach out to the neighborhoods that would be considered as low and moderate income, or has a higher concentration of low and moderate income or minority population.
Okay, let me put a pause button on this. Sabina, you're the last question. Then we'll open up to attendees. Planning Commission has a meeting tonight, and it's coming up quick. Last question, Council Members Zafar, and then open to public comment.
Yeah, my question was just going to be, since this is obviously we're projections for the next 10 years as well, how much attention are we paying to the age demographics and making sure we are building for, and planning for a population which is going to be changing, right? You'll have the 16-year-olds that are 26, and you have the 55-year-olds that are 65. So
yeah, perfect question. And definitely that's something that we looked at, and looking at how do you accommodate aging in place? How do you accommodate the younger folks who want to live and, maybe, used to grow up in San Ramon, went out to college and may want to come back to the community? What kind of housing option, what kind of environment that they would like to live in? And how do you provide? That's the reason why a variety of housing types and density is important, because you have, different needs at different age as you move through the, your life, cycle.
Okay, we're going to open up the public comment, or we're not going to be able to make any comments ourselves. And that's a big part of what this update is. So the public comment is open. If you wish to speak under public comment in this item, please use the raise your hand feature on Zoom, or dial *9 on your telephone. It's your turn to talk. We'll call upon you by name if provided. Remarks are limited to 3 minutes per person. And the clock will be running on the Zoom screen. Okay, we have one person in attending who wants to speak. Do we have any written before I open this up, Christina? There you are. Any written
Yep.
comments on this?
We have no written comments for this item.
Okay, let's bring in the attendee call in user 1. You have 3 minutes and we can hear you.
Hi, City Council. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, please cover all of your ears because this is for the attorneys and Ms. Tam. Ms. Tam, I'm a resident of San Ramon from Taiwan. You remind me of someone who probably just launched in on a flight from communist China.
Oh, time out. Wait. This is about an update for our general plan. No personal remarks like this. Keep it to the general plan of what we've been discussing tonight, please. But continue. Is that it?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
What is building by right? What right do you have? Do you pay my taxes? Do you pay to City of San Ramon? No, you don't. Indeed, I'm actually paying you probably. I just found a bunch of records, public records, that you've been getting paid $170 an hour from West Hollywood. You are just like Scott Rafferty. What are you? You have absolutely zero right. My council members can cover their ears. I know they're gonna fight you, but I will. This is my city. You have no right. We will not rezone for you. Get that and get lost. Thank you.
Okay, public comments closed that have been aired users. Sorry, Veronica. Yes, there is such a thing called bill by right, and it's getting closer to a reality. And it is not by any of our consultants. It is coming down from the state. And the state makes laws, we follow them. Anyway, the public comments closed. Are there any comments from the Planning Commission or City Council before we get to let them go through their meeting? Because I have a couple. If I may start off, I don't see any hands up. I will just say, just from reading SB 8, SB 9, SB 10, it's like a whole new ball game out there. That's why, Veronica, when you brought up SB 9, I go, oh boy, I can't wait to see how that one turns out. Specific plans don't stop residential. Open space doesn't stop residential. Commercials doesn't stop residential. If you're not going to make your numbers, you're going to rezone to it. There's a new world order out there in the state. And it's very clear that performance over planning. You are going to see these things produced. The old excuse, well, we only do the planning, isn't going to cut it anymore. I know at one of the meetings I was listening to, the question was asked, does SB 330 apply? Yes. I don't care what the legal interpretation is. That is the direction of the state of California, and they're not fooling around. We will follow that direction, or they'll do it. If there was asked for some strategies, I would just say this to planners and council staff, anyone listening. If you're going to say no to a housing residential project, you better have a defensible position, a concrete defensible findings for court, or we're going to lose. SB 375 is clear, burden of proof is on us. And I'm really worried that some of these locations that might come in, you're going to see a substitution, because I'm a little more sensitive than what I thought I heard tonight to our existing retail locations. And I see a battle coming up on that one. I'll leave it at that. UGB is going to probably die around 2026. I read some of these things that, Veronica, you mentioned something about the appeals. I'm on the appeal committee. We meet Friday, and the last one will be a week from Friday, and nobody's winning the appeals. The only one that got close was the County of Contra Costa gave 35 of theirs to Pittsburgh. And the reasons are what lead me to believe things like SB 330 and many more are coming. I'll read one. I thought this was an opportunity to do something, and it went nowhere. Regarding the arena objectives related to promoting and improved intra-regional relationship between jobs and housing, including an improved balance between the number of low-wage jobs and number of housing units affordable to low-wage workers in each jurisdiction. And I asked the question, does that mean that Danville and San Ramon, if they're making that numbers, or if they can't make that numbers, that you know, we can't do it? It's no, that number that has to be reached is for the entire Bay Area, which leads me to believe, why are we doing vehicle miles traveled if that's the case? Would it work for Clayton and Concord? No, we are feeding the business parks that are not necessarily in our area, and so are the others. All of the appeals in Marin County failed miserably, and I have no idea where they're going to put that, but they're stuck with the number. We are given a responsibility. That's the answer that I hope the other person was looking at. Veronica isn't coming up with a responsibility. It came from HCD, and that's why you're going to have a hard time changing anything that's against the methodology. Okay, the first person, Vice Mayor Perkins, you wanted to make a comment.
I wanted to thank the consultants for the presentation. Gosh, there's a lot of work in front of us, and I do hope the public participates at each of the opportunities for public input. A lot of work to be done. Thank you very much for the work you've done so far.
Yeah, you got your work cut out for you. Sridhar.
Yes, thank you very much for great work here. From my side, a couple of feedbacks, especially on the general plan. I want to keep it more flexible, especially as Brent mentioned, the state is doling out a lot of new laws, and we need to be flexible to be ready to take up those changes on that. And also we need to focus on including some transportation issues. And one of the major thing that is going through within our community is about emotional health issues, like mental health issues. That one should be part of our plan. We need to figure out. And on business retail side, you know, we are mostly car to go, place to place community, especially Dottie Valley region. We have a major issue about lack of retail. One of the Dottie Valley specific plan specifically mentions about village center. So I agree with Roger when he mentioned that we need to seek opportunities. So this is one of the opportunity. I think we need to have that as part of our plan. Once again, affordable housing, thanks for presenting all those details. I'm really looking forward for next upcoming meetings on this. Thank you.
Okay, Rick, chime in, please.
Mr. Mayor, this is simply a request. The slide presentation from all of the consultants was very informative and even provocative. I wonder if we could ask that the slide presentation be printed out and given to each of the planning commissioners so that we can start boning up on some of this stuff and getting ready for what's coming.
I will make the request to staff that all 10 of us get that, especially that one line about build by right. And unfortunately, I see too much of it, so I know it's coming, but that's another problem we won't discuss tonight. Councilmember Zafar.
Yeah, quickly, one, I really appreciated the presentation. I think it's been very comprehensive, and you know, I have learned a lot in the process as well. As we think about planning, obviously things are changing rapidly. You're seeing all these big organizations, and the new way of working from home or hybrid is becoming the new norm. You know, whether it's Amazon or it's Apple or it's Google, you know, you're seeing that shift, and I think it's going to be something which we won't probably know in the next year, and you know, by the time we finalize, but that's something we really need to pay attention to, in my opinion, that as people are living in our community, we're no longer a bedroom community. We're a community where people will live, work, and play. And so making sure that we capture all of that as we plan for this. So thank you so much for a great presentation.
Thank you. Commissioners Edwards and Alpert. And then we're not going to let Armstrong talk because he talks too much. Go ahead, Corey. She's just been too quiet tonight. Where'd she go? She was on my screen a minute ago. Did she leave?
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor Hudson. I would just like to encourage my fellow commissioners and members of the City Council to perhaps look at this process as an opportunity. We have an extraordinary community here in San Ramon. We have a lot of underutilized land right near our transportation corridors. And I think there is great potential here. I think there is great opportunity for us to facilitate the development of neighborhoods. And I think we do have an opportunity when we were looking at this general plan update and updates of some of our specific plans to really look at the process here as something that lets us create something greater than the sum of its parts. We don't need to be looking at the RENA numbers as one project at a time. I think we can be looking at things more holistically and think about some of the potentials and the opportunities that we have to really develop something new. And that's very good for our young people, good for the people that are going to grow up in this community and are going to want to stay.
Okay, very nicely said, Mr. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had one question for Roger. I didn't see in the scope of work or the plan for the economic element if there would be an analysis of retail leakage. And if not, I'm hoping that it will, because that looked like a pretty significant contributing factor to our loss of sales tax compared to the rest of the county. And then my second point, and I think I picked it up on Veronica's slide, the requirements to consider in-flight projects as being June of 2022. So perhaps a request that at some point, when appropriate, we can do a review of all of the projects that we've approved that have not been built yet, and maybe some discussion on what's preventing them from getting built. Because if it is June of 2022, a lot of the work we've done in the past 3 or 4 years may not count. So those are my 2 questions or requests.
Okay.
I'll jump in on the first question if I could.
Yep.
So yes, when I mentioned that we'll be doing a retail market analysis, the leakage analysis is definitely a part of that. In fact, it's the very first part. We look at where are we now? What's the baseline? And leakage represents potential development opportunities right now. And then we look at how that might change over time with change of population and demographics and the regional competitive setting. So definitely we'll be looking at leakage and highlighting where there might be opportunities from that.
Okay, let me make a couple of comments and then we'll turn it loose to those poor planning commissioners that got to sit through another 5 hours. No, and I do appreciate the job because I was there. We're in the 5,111 homes because at the last minute, the methodology for the RENA numbers to make that 441,000 changed. 52,000 homes went out of Santa Clara where they belong, and they went to the rest of this. Once that got approved by HCD, it doesn't matter anymore. All of this argument about how dare you, Veronica has nothing to do with that. She's just coming up with a formula that's got to make this thing work. The 5111 will probably hold. We have appeals on Friday and a couple more on the following Friday, and then a recommendation to go to the whole board, so we'll be ready to go. I was a little surprised to see October is the date for the housing element when we haven't finalized the 5111. It's not going down. To fight and try and get some of these appeals through would have been even worse because the methodology, how they split it, is not common sense. The problem that we're going to have in a nutshell is when I start reading this and I have to read it off at every single appeal. Government Code Section 65, 584.04 states, ABAG may not limit consideration of suitable housing sites to a jurisdiction's existing zoning and land use restrictions. You can probably read the rest of it yourself. This is going to be tough. You're going to have to make these very low, even extremely low. I'm gonna hit with that yet, moderate. And that very low number is a monster. So that's what I'm looking at. I can understand where he's coming from for the retail component, but retail is off. There's going to be a lot of these places that you might do some changes. But then again, this was all done for climate change, folks. These RENA numbers, the housing is the transportation component of AB 32. We're trying to put housing next to jobs and shopping. Isn't that one of the words we had? So if we turn around and build 5,000 homes and people have to drive 5 miles to shop, we really haven't done it well. So I'm going to be looking at those things when it comes back. I see 6:53. If we quit now, we can give you a couple minutes to go get a Coke and finish off your fries. I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I think it was a good conversation. We learned an awful lot. I really appreciate Rick's comment of let's get this stuff in writing so we can look at it again. If you want to look at my appeals, I got a 5-inch stack here on my desk. You can all come in and read them if you want, right next to the legislation that let me know this is all coming ahead of time. But that SB 9, Veronica, I think is extremely important for what's coming down the pike and some of these 100% affordable housing units. And anything to do with, Sridhar asked about 15%. What happens for if you get to that fourth level of incentives, 38, 43%, whatever it is, and some of the legislation that goes with that. At this time, at 6:54, we'll give you 6 minutes to go get fries and a Coke. And thank you all for coming out. Special thanks to our consultant. It was very informative. And have a great meeting tonight. We are adjourned.